Hello again. I'm Brownfield Ag News anchor reporter Ken Anderson, and we're going to visit again today with Frank Chen. Frank is a journalist with the Asia Times media outlet, and he's based in Hong Kong. We have visited with Frank on a periodic basis here over the past year, talking about U.S. China relations and other issues related to the Asian continent. Well, Frank, it's really good to see you again.
Good to see you again, Ken.
It's been about 3 months now since we last visited, so we have a lot to catch up on. A lot has happened in that
Mhm.
period as far as the US China trade talks are concerned. The two sides are now reportedly on the verge of a phase one trade deal that
That's right.
with that would have a major focus on agriculture, and that's of
Yeah.
a lot of interest to the farmers and ranchers, of course, in
Mhm.
our country. So I'm anxious to hear how
Mhm.
that deal and how those talks are being viewed over there.
Well, interestingly, no one could have forecasted the signing of the phase one deal, even though it is a tentative deal, it is a preliminary one, would be scuppered by Chile's last minute cancellation of the APEC summit this month. So there have been reports saying that Beijing and Washington have been in contact, deciding a new location for this signing. The Chinese President Xi Jinping may fly to the US, either to Washington, D.C., or to Florida or wherever else, to meet Trump in person, to shake hands, toast champagne, and sign the deal. And there will be a lot of photo ops. And obviously, discussions about a new location, a new venue for the signing could be the easiest part of the broader trade negotiations. And some of the latest reports also claim that both countries have agreed to gradually roll back on the punitive tariffs or they slapped on each other's exports. But we can't take that for granted unless a formal deal is signed in due course. And that is that. I think Beijing's real purpose of agreeing to all the demands of signing the deal is to convince Trump to scrap or at least delay the imposition of further punitive tariffs, as otherwise almost all of China's exports to the US would be subject to sanctions, tariffs. But after the signing of the deal, I think Beijing may well choose to roll the dice on the outcome of the 2020 presidential race to see whether there will be a new tenant in the White House. Beijing will never rush to reach a bad deal, a more substantive deal at this point. Beijing would rather choose to wait and see. But as for Donald Trump, I think he is more eager to strike a big deal, a beautiful deal in his own words. As he has to convince his voters, his base, that he is the president who can force China to come to all the terms, to honor its promises, to he's the leader who can right all the wrongs in the trade relationship with the US, with China. And that fact may well put Trump in a weaker position throughout future trade negotiations. And with the election fast approaching and with an impending impeachment inquiry, I think Trump really needs a big deal to either deflect the public attention or convince his voters. And Beijing is fully aware of that. And Beijing can choose to take time. And also, let's not forget the fact that both Trump and Xi, they are quite impulsive figures. They're very unpredictable. So when we have the two chiefs and their respective teams sitting on the negotiating table, no one can really forecast what will be the outcome. There could be a truce, a big deal, a far-reaching deal overnight, or there could be a full fallout, a complete fallout, a full-blown confrontation between the two biggest economies. No one really knows. But I still suspect that Trump may envy Xi Jinping pretty much. He has to fight pretty hard next year to secure his presidency. But Xi Jinping will never have to face any election like this, nor does he have any checks and balances at home. Last year he single-handedly mandated a bill to be rubber stamped by the Chinese parliament to a parliament that exists in name only, to scrap the presidential term limit. So nowadays he is China's president for life, even though it is a largely ceremonial office, and the real power rests with the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, another post that he also holds. And as for that post, there's no term limit. So he can stay in power for as long as he likes or until he kicks the bucket. Just like Mao Zedong, he was China's top leader until he died. And throughout the 70 years since the founding of the communist regime, only two top party leaders, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, chose to conform to the unwritten rule to step down in the 10th year to serve only a 10-year tenure. But Xi Jinping can well choose to change that new tradition and stay in power for as long as he likes. And in a nutshell, I think Trump may envy Xi Jinping pretty much, and he may wonder that perhaps he should have started his political career in China.
Yeah, good point. Let's talk about the agricultural part of this, Frank. You know, a lot of the talk over here is about African swine fever that has decimated China's hog herd, and we all know how important pork is in the diet in China. And some thinking that maybe they're agreeing to this deal because they're concerned about the protein needs of their people. Are you hearing much about that?
Well, pork is some sort of a comfort food for most of the Chinese people. But nowadays, the younger generation, they may prefer beef than to pork. And since probably almost a year ago, that the Chinese government has mandated the farms, its state-owned enterprises, food processing companies, to stockpile on imported pork to produce all these sorts of frozen meat, sausage, to make sure that there should be adequate market supply to maintain, to stabilize the price. From my perspective, I haven't seen any strong public grievance over the short supply of pork or the soaring prices. But we still need to see, when the New Year is coming, when the Chinese Spring Festival is coming, we in early next year in January, we will see how things will shape up. But I think that the Chinese government still have the room, the maneuver to make sure, and they still have time to find new sources. And this week actually, French President Macron was in Shanghai and Beijing, and part of the very gigantic trade pact between the two countries include some French pork for Chinese people, and Chinese people would like to try something new here.
I wanted to ask you too about the latest in the protests happening there in Hong Kong. We heard a lot about them in the summer. We haven't heard as much lately, and there was some discussion about those during the discussion about the trade talks, that they might become a factor in those. That discussion has died down again as well. What is the situation now?
Well, before talking about the protests in Hong Kong, I'd like to add some figures from the U.S. government about the trade between China and the U.S. Statistics from the U.S. government show that trade deficit with China reached $420 billion in 2018, compared with $375 billion in 2017. So it has been a year since Trump waged the trade war, but it seems that the deficit still grew. And I don't have the latest figure about the first 3 quarters, but I doubt there will be any substantial drop on that front. But very interestingly, US also gets its single largest trade surplus from another part of China, which is literally part of China, but largely operates on its own. Hong Kong is the single largest source of America's trade surplus all over the years. And in 2018, that amount stood at 31 billion US dollars, the single largest source of trade surplus. So if US really wants to offset part of the very gigantic trade deficit with China, I think it should really focus on how to further double down on its efforts to boost trade and business with Hong Kong to channel more surplus from the city. And when it comes to agricultural products, it's also very interesting that here in Hong Kong, we can already buy a lot of oranges, apples, and some beef from the US. And given another fact, very interesting fact is that for I think more than 10 years in a row, Hong Kong has been the single largest buyer of Japanese agricultural products, everything from its salmon, fruit, vegetable to its processed food, snacks. So people here, the consumers here in Hong Kong, they are very open-minded. They like to try something new, and they generally do not trust food from China. They think they are not so they're not so safe to consume. But food, agricultural products from Japan, from the US, they welcome this stuff. So I think that for US farmers, the US agricultural sector, they should really think how to further promote, further market their products in Hong Kong, given the huge potential here. Despite the city's small size, it only has a population of over 7 million people, but they have huge appetite here. And the same with Taiwan, the same with those countries in Southeast Asia. So when American farmers, American companies find it difficult to further penetrate into the Chinese market, when Beijing also has to take care of its own farmers, when Chinese consumers may still buy those pork, these orange produced locally because they are simply cheaper. I think there are other markets across Asia that can be further tapped. And when it comes to the protests here in Hong Kong, it has been a useful leverage for Donald Trump throughout the trade negotiations, especially at the very beginning, or especially when the two sides are having get some sticky points they cannot agree upon. And then Trump may simply pay some lip service to those protesters in Hong Kong to pile some extra pressure on the Beijing government. And ironically, those Democrats in the Congress, they are more eager to sanction those people in Beijing or in the Hong Kong government who undermine Hong Kong's freedoms or democracy, more eager than Trump does. But when the two sides are about to sign a deal, a phase one deal, I think Hong Kong takes a back seat. And nowadays, it's really more about the interest of those American people living in Hong Kong and those American business operating here in Hong Kong, rather than the overall trade relationships between the two joints. So it's obviously there's a huge presence of U.S. business community in Hong Kong, and there are I heard the latest number is that there are more than 300,000 U.S. citizens living in Hong Kong, and their well-being, their safety, and their commercial interests should be taken care of. But I don't think this will be among the top priorities, the top agenda for Donald Trump. nowadays he really wants to secure a deal. He really wants to sign a deal as a proof of his one of his biggest achievements during his first 4 years to convince his people. So I don't think Hong Kong will be in his mind anymore.
Frank, always good to get your perspective on these issues, and look forward to visiting with you again down the road. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ken.